come and sit with you now, so if you'll stand up if you don't think your child can see you, they're going to come sit with you. So come on down. Go sit with your moms and dads. Natalie's there.
I don't have my dad on.
Okay, go over to your mom. Go see
I
your
don't
mom.
have my dad or my mom.
That's okay. We'll watch your sister. How about that? Okay? We'll watch your sisters. You can sit by her.
Always bring lots of fun and energy at that age. Would you stand with me as we sing Shout to the Lord?
Offertory prayer. Father, we just thank you for these children and all the people that work with them, and we just praise you for that they're learning about you here in the church, and they're learning music about you. We just ask you to be with us now this night. We thank you for all our blessings, and just take these tithes and offerings and use them for the further your kingdom in Cleveland, Tennessee, and around the world. Down and we pray. Amen.
We're so glad you could be here tonight. I just wanted to share a little bit before we start. We've spent the first part of 2019 talking about praise and worship and what the difference is in just preparing for a performance and actually worshiping on Wednesday nights whenever we're learning our songs. And so tonight we're going to sing for you. We may not be perfect, but we ask that you worship with us as we sing.
All to Jesus I surrender, all to Him I freely give. I will ever love and trust Him in His presence daily live. I surrender all. I surrender
We thank all of our children, their leaders, family members who make sure they're here for rehearsals on Wednesday night. We look forward to later in May that they're going to be featured a little bit more. And thank you all for coming and supporting and encouraging them. I like to say that we get our salvation from the Bible. We learn theology from our worship songs. And putting these songs as people articulating the faith and the poetry of the lyrics, they stay with us because we tend to remember things that we've sung, and it will stay with them for a lifetime. So rejoice and be glad with that. And appreciate you visitors too. We had some of our extended family here and our Big City University family and members with us tonight. We're always grateful for their presence too. I've been sharing so many great stories in the Gospels, the stories about people's encounters with Jesus. And so if you don't regularly worship with us, I'm sharing this season a series of messages about people who have seen Jesus. Let's call it simply, I've Seen Jesus. And we've talked about blind Bartimaeus, and this morning talked about Zacchaeus. I want to go on to the Passion Week story tonight and talk a little bit about a character we kind of know of. I remember as a kid about the age of these elementary school kids in church, it being a trivia question about who was offered with Jesus to avoid crucifixion. And the character's name is Barabbas. And we read about Barabbas in all 4 of the Gospels, which is a little bit unusual because it's rare for a character. Like we had Zacchaeus this morning, he's only in Luke. But I did a little search. Barabbas in all 4 Gospels. But let me share with you, and you can read along on the projection, the words of the Gospel of Mark about him, and then a little bit about his story. This is a part of the rest of Jesus. He's standing before Pilate on trial on Good Friday morning, and it says this. Now it was custom at the festival to release a prisoner whom the people requested. A man named Barabbas was in prison with the insurrectionists who had committed murder in the uprising. The crowd came up and asked Pilate to do for them what he usually did. Do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews? Asked Pilate, knowing it was out of self-interest that the chief priest had handed Jesus over to him. But the chief priest stirred at the crowd to have Pilate release Barabbas instead. What shall I do then with the one you call the king of the Jews? Pilate asked them. Crucify him, they shouted. Why? What crime has he committed? Asked Pilate. And they shouted all the louder, Crucify him! Wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them. He had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. This is God's word for God's people. And I call this series, I've Seen Jesus. But we really are never told specifically, explicitly in any of those 4 Gospels, including Mark that we just read that tells Barabbas that he ever actually saw Jesus. We use our imagination there in that story that Pilate there standing before the religious leaders and the crowd, and he offers them the choice, who will I release to you? Jesus on the one side or Barabbas on the other, and we portray it in our art. Can you see there with Pilate and his back to us and Jesus on the left, our left, and Barabbas on the right, like he's offering a choice. And so it takes a little imagination, but we go there. We go there in our minds, we go there in our art to see that Barabbas and Jesus perhaps at least made some contact with each other. But we have to use our imagination to fill in the gaps. So that's what I want to do with us just for a little while tonight, is think about the character Barabbas and ask you to join me in using your imagination. There are certain things that I am glad that God doesn't tell me. How about you? I'm glad God doesn't tell me everything he knows about my life. And one of the things I'm glad he doesn't tell me is I'm glad he doesn't tell me what day I'm going to die. Most people don't know what that is, what day that would be. It'd be a pretty rare, uncommon exception for someone to know the day he's going to die. But Barabbas knew the day that he was going to die. It says in there he was a part of an insurrection. He was part of a murder that had been committed. There were some sinister things that had taken place, and certainly he had been arrested. He had been put on trial, and intentionally here at the Zenith in Jerusalem of Passover week, right at the eve of the Sabbath, he and two others alongside of him were scheduled to be crucified as an example to what happens to those who cross the Roman Empire, to be a deterrent to those. Now, what would inspire someone to take such a risk in life, to risk the crucifixion, the cruelty of the cross? Well, we don't actually know in his case. Again, we just have to use our imagination and speculate. Perhaps some of it is in his name. Because in the Bible, when the letters B-A-R, bar is before someone's name, it means son of. We talked last Sunday morning about Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus. Jesus calls Peter Simon Bar-Jonah at one point, which tells us that Simon, Peter's father's name was Jonah, and so he was Bar-Jonah, son of Jonah. So Barabbas is Barabbas, and Abbas is a version of the word for father, which may not tell us much, son of the father, and sons have fathers, but maybe there's more there. Because father would also be the word that would be used of a rabbi, a teacher. Now let's go with that. Imagine like these small children, and the home would be the central point of all the spiritual education that tended to take place, taught from young age by his teacher father, the rabbi, about the history of his people and how proud they were and how God's hand was on them in a unique way. And other nations of the world could be led by men, but not us. We were God's people, and we're led by God through the leaders of his people, and so it would be rubbing against the grain of all he believed in, bought into, to have a Roman Empire ruling over God's people. And Barabbas must have believed that, and some would say he believed it too much, because it became part of a rebellion, part of an undermining of the Roman presence there to frustrate them, to seek the freedom of the Hebrew people. If it crossed some lines and people lost lives in the meanwhile, especially Romans, so be it. What happened? Did somebody rat him out to the Romans? Did the Romans figure it out themselves and have him arrested? Did somebody make a mistake in one of their operations? I don't know, but Barabbas is arrested. He would stand before Pilate, who had the authority to order crucifixions, find himself condemned, and there in the Fortress Antonia, which was inside of the walls of Jerusalem, right next to the temple. So the Hebrew people, you go about your business, don't forget, Rome's right here, and we're watching, and don't do anything to stir up trouble. And inside that fortress, there were prison cells, and that was the last home of Barabbas. Think about him the night before the crucifixion, that long Thursday night. He knows, I'm going to die the next day. Now, you would hope if you knew you were going to die the next day, your last day would be in comfort. You'd like to think you'd be surrounded by people who love you, and it would be at ease and without pain, but he is in a filthy cell, and it's dark, and he's been fed the minimum amount of food just to keep him alive until his public execution would take place. And they wait all night, and finally, the first lights of dawn come, and not only the lights of the dawn, but the sound of the city that's awakening, because in Jerusalem during Passover, the population would multiply 4 times as many people as usually live there. The pilgrimage of people coming to Jerusalem for Passover. So not only the light, but the sound would tell him the day was coming. And finally, this dreaded moment where he hears the sound first in the distance and then coming forward, the sound of boots hitting the hard pavement in a regular pace, until they got louder and louder and louder, and they stopped at the door to his cell. He heard the bolt, the bar, slide heavily into place, and the old squeaky door cell swing open, and the Roman guards step in. Pointing to him, the commander would say, "Fetch Barabbas!" And grabbing Barabbas, and his arms shackled and his ankles shackled together, only to be able to shuffle along in the walk, they drag him out into the dimly lit hallway and take him down the way. And along the way, the leader says, "Barabbas, it's your lucky day. You're up for a pardon from Pilate himself." Barabbas might say back, "Don't mock a condemned man. Don't toy with me today. It's hard enough to face the cross without your jokes." I'm not kidding. Pilate is going to invoke the tradition to allow a prisoner to be set free, and he's going to have a choice between you and a man named Jesus of Nazareth. Could it be turn a corner and walk out to Pilate's hall, stands over the courtyard, and there at that very spot where some days before Barabbas had stood with Pilate, he had announced his condemnation and his ultimate execution, there was Pilate standing there again. And as he approached, he could look into the courtyard, and there were the religious leaders. They were almost as bad as the Romans because they are in allegiance with them. They dealt in harmony with them. They were corrupt. And there on the other side of Pilate was Jesus. He could tell, Barabbas could, he had been beaten badly. He was hurting. And yet there's some kind of a strength that came from Jesus that he could sense. Now with Barabbas on one side and Jesus on the other and Pilate in the middle, Pilate stands before and he says, "Now, who would you have me release to you?" Barabbas must have thought, I don't have a chance in this referendum. Nobody wants to see me alive. I was going to be the only mourner at my own funeral. And yet, to his surprise, he hears a voice call out his name. "Barabbas! Give us Barabbas!" And another, "Barabbas! We want Barabbas! Barabbas! Barabbas!" And as surprised that Barabbas was, Pilate also seemed to be surprised because it wasn't what he was expecting. And so he turns and tries to appeal to the crowd. "But what will I do with Jesus, who is called your Messiah? Crucify him," the shouts change. "Give us Barabbas, crucify him." And despite his best efforts to sway the crowd to permission to release Jesus, they cry out, "Barabbas." And washing his hands before them and saying, "I'm innocent of this man Jesus' blood," Jesus is taken away. And the guard comes up to Barabbas with a key in his hand. And he unlocks the shackles on his hands. And he unlocks the shackles on his feet. And stands before the crowd and announces a proclamation. "One Barabbas, by special order of the law of Israel and in concert with the practice of clemency of imperial Rome, this pardon is now extended to you, approved by His Excellency Pontius Pilate, procurator of Judea under the exalted Emperor Tiberius." And with that and a small shove to his back, Barabbas is set free and walks out among the crowd. But can you imagine? He walks backwards because in any moment he expects they're coming back after me. The shackles will go back on. This is just too good to be true. And backs away until he's out of eye shot with the Roman guard, and then around the corner, and he bolts! And he runs through the windy streets of the old city till he gets to his good friend's house, and he pounds on the door. "Let me in! Let me in! It's Barabbas!" His friend comes to the door. "What are you doing? You're supposed to be dead." "I know, I got a pardon. It was me, Jesus, let me in." And he comes in, his friend serves him food like he hasn't had in so long. And they celebrate and they rejoice. But after the moment of excitement passes, something happens to Barabbas' heart. Maybe it's survivor's guilt. Maybe it's empathy for his two friends who are facing their cruel fate. But he's drawn back out of his friend's home, back down the windy streets, like a criminal going back to the scene of the crime. And he meets the death march as his friends carrying heavy crosses, and now here comes Jesus, beaten even further, crown of thorns around his head, carrying the heavy cross. And he keeps his distance just enough to stay within eye shot and ear shot, but prayerfully not to be noticed. And he hears the nail and the ping of the hammer against them into the wood. He sees the crosses stood up with Jesus and his two friends affixed to them, suspended between heaven and earth. He hears the mocking of the religious leaders to Jesus and the sounds of the distribution of these people's last worldly goods, their garments, as they are divided among the soldiers, and the last gambled over, Jesus' garment. And can you use your imagination? That maybe for just one moment, maybe for just a moment, the eyes of Barabbas and the eyes of Jesus suspended on the cross meet for just a moment. And a thought comes to Barabbas that he hadn't thought of before. That cross that Jesus is hanging on, that cross that Jesus is dying on, Barabbas thinks, that's my cross. That cross was supposed to be for me. Can you meet Jesus' eyes? Can you see him suspended between heaven and earth? And my friends, young and old, can you say, that's my cross? Oh, sometimes we'll say it with softer language. He died for me. He took my place. But the long and short of it is this. God demonstrates his love for us that while we were sinners, Christ died for us. He took my cross. That's my cross. That's what I deserve. And an old gospel song says, I should have been crucified. I should have suffered and died. I should have hung on that cross in disgrace. But Jesus, God's Son, took my place. And that is Barabbas' story. And that is my story. And if you love and your faith and your trust is in him, that's your story too. That's your cross he died upon. So we're getting ready to come into the season of the year. We think more about these events and these stories and these things. And let it weigh with some weight upon our hearts that while we were sinners, Jesus died for me and for you. I want to ask you to stand with me as a moment of benediction. Our benediction this year is coming from the book of Revelation, chapter 5. It's part of the vision that John has of heaven and the opening of telling the story of eternity and how history is going to come to a close. And that story, it tells us at the beginning of chapter 5, is in a scroll that is sealed. And only one who is worthy can open the seals. And there is grief because in all of creation and all of angels and all of the lives of those in heaven, there is not found one who is worthy to open the scroll until the Lamb shows up. Then I saw a lamb looking as if it had been slain, standing in the center of the throne, encircled by the 4 living creatures and the elders. And they sang a new song. You are worthy to take the scroll and to open its seals, because you were slain, and with your blood you purchased men for God from every tribe and every language and every people and every nation. Worthy is the Lamb who was slain. And then this word of song and praise that we say aloud as our benediction, because the Lamb was slain on the cross, on my cross for me, we say this. Say it with me as we close. Let's start with the reference as we usually do and close with this. Revelation 5:13, to him who sits on the throne and to the Lamb be praise and honor and glory and power forever and ever. You are dismissed.